Hello and welcome to the FatBoss Guide to Evil Tree on Mythic in the Emerald Nightmare.
So this encounter on Mythic is still a very delicate encounter. It requires a lot of communication and it's more or less complete ad control. There isn't necessarily that high of a DPS requirement on this encounter, which does allow you to bring extra healers. We would recommend that you bring 5, but you could bring 6 if you really are struggling. As for the rest of your composition, you can bring virtually whatever you like, but do keep in mind that anything that helps you control ads, such as death grips or typhoons or vortexes, things of that nature, are very, very useful.
Now, although there has been some rather large mechanical changes, the 4 ads that you'll be fighting still have remained the same. The Dominator tentacles still need to be picked up by 1 tank each, and you need to face the ground slam away from anyone else. The death glares need to be interrupted and killed off eventually. The corruptors need to be absolutely annihilated because the debuff they apply not only puts the goo everywhere, which limits your movement, but it really, really fucking hurts. These guys need to die super quickly, and the nightmare horrors, the tanks need to taunt on 2 while keeping the horror out of the group to make it so the goo isn't in the middle of the room. So these all act the same way and need to be countered in the same way. However, the ads that have changed are the blobs and the eye itself. Now, on top of just blasting random people, the eye has one brand new ability called Death Blossom. This will create several patches spread out around the center of the room. After a 15-second cast, each of these patches will explode, dealing a burst of damage to the entire raid per blossom and applying a hard-hitting dot to each player. The amount of damage this dot deals is absolutely outrageous. Even if one of these goes off, it can very much be a wipe. So in order to prevent these from being applied, you need to soak the blossoms. If a player stands in the blossom, they'll just take a burst of damage, but the blossom will not do damage to the raid, and it will not apply a dot to anyone. So all of these blossoms do need to be soaked, and generally speaking, it's pretty hard to assign who is going to soak which blossom, because at different points of the encounter, you might need to be kiting ads or killing off corruptor tentacles on the far sides of the room. So as a rule of thumb, what we recommend that you do is just enter the patches as soon as possible so people can see which ones aren't soaked, which is indicated by a red beam coming out of them. They can see the ones which have the red beam, they know they need to be soaked, and they can go over and soak them as soon as they can. Sometimes blossoms can be stacked on top of one another, allowing one player to soak multiple patches at once. That's absolutely fine, and it does of course make it so more players can be out and about doing stuff, but that player does need to be aware that they're going to be taking 2 bursts of damage rather than 1, or maybe even 3 or 4 if they got super lucky, so they are going to need some sort of personal cooldown or an external one if it's super bad. To add on to this, the blossoms can also spawn in some of the corrupted ground pools which spawn for the corrupted tentacles or the nightmare horrors. In this case, you do not want to stand in the blossom and the pool for the entire duration, because not only are you going to be silenced, but you're going to be taking a ton of ticking damage as well. Instead, you want to enter the blossom on the last couple seconds of the Death Blossom cast to avoid taking the extra damage from the pool whilst of course still soaking it. It's just super important that you let everyone else know, I'm going to be getting this blossom inside the pool, so people don't panic and try and panic soak it and then maybe leaves gaps somewhere else. Just let everyone know, I've got this blossom pool, I'm going to be taking it. Now moving on to the blobs, these act the exact same way as they did on Heroic. They'll fixate a player and chase them. They'll also apply a dot if they get a melee swing off, and this really hurts on Mythic and should be avoided as much as possible. If you're over 2, you need to be dispelled, and really no one should ever really get 1. Now when they die, they will explode, dealing damage to anyone nearby, as well as the eye. However, on Mythic, instead of dealing 5% damage to the eye each time, they now deal just under 5%, meaning that you'll need 22 blobs to kill the eye rather than 20. Now the most noticeable change to the blobs, and maybe even the entire fight, is that when they do explode, they'll leave a nasty 4-second dot on the entire raid, regardless if they're in the circle or not, and this does stack up. This dot hits so hard that on 1 or 2 stacks you can kind of get away with not using healing cooldowns, but anything over 3 stacks is very likely going to need a healing cooldown. Now because of this, you need to kill the blobs throughout the entire fight in a staggered fashion, killing them slowly enough and making sure that you don't overlap the dot that they give you, whilst killing them quickly enough that you can get the room nice and clean before going inside the tree itself. And this is where the difficulty of the encounter lies, just making sure the ads die correctly, not just underneath the eye, but also at the correct time underneath the eye. Because if you just have one ad killed at the wrong time or in the wrong place, it can very easily lead to a wipe.
And because the blobs are so important, we're going to spend the rest of the video explaining to you exactly what you need to do at what point in the encounter, all the way from the start to the finish. But before you even pull the boss, it's vital that you set up your healing cooldowns into 2 different sets. The reason why you do this is because you're going to be blowing multiple blobs up all at the same time right from the very start, and if you don't use a healing cooldown on both of these sets, you're going to wipe. So when you first pull the boss, you'll have the 2 Dominator tentacles, one on the left and one on the right. We nuke down the left one while we have our entire raid stacked underneath the right one. As soon as the left one is dead, all the 4 blobs will start moving over towards the right group. We make sure that we stun them, we CC them under the eye, and just blow them up as much as we possibly can. Ideally, killing them all at the same time, otherwise the dot can become staggered, which makes healing cooldowns not necessarily always cover it, especially if you get the 4th application of the dot right at the end of the 3rd one. So make sure that they die at the same time and use your first set of healing cooldowns. And for us, this is a Spirit Link, a Healing Tide, and an Aura Mastery. A Deathglare Tentacle will spawn, just die up and keep it interrupted, and finish off the 2nd Dominator, and this is when you'll get the next 4 adds, do the exact same thing what you just did with the first set, and use your 2nd set of healing cooldowns. This for us is a Trank, a Hymn, and another Aura Mastery. You'll then want to kill off the Deathglare and then just kill the blobs under the eye one by one, making sure that you don't overlap the dot, and at the same time you'll have to soak your first set of Death Blossoms. You'll then have a Night Horror spawn, start DPSing it, but get ready to switch to the 2 Corruptor and the 2 Deathglare Tentacles that spawn right next to the eye. Once you've killed them off, slowly kite the blobs around and kill them off one by one. Now, not all DPS need to be assisting with the blobs. We actually have our range focused down the horror, while only a few range DPS, such as Shadow Priest, that can just dot them all up, and the melee deal with the blobs by killing them under the eye one by one. However, you cannot be too slow with this process, so if you are struggling with this and you're not killing the blobs off quick enough, then look at focusing more range DPS to switch to the blobs just so they do die quickly. You want to be in a situation that as soon as one blob has died, you've got the debuff and it's dropped, another one is almost immediately applied within the same second. You need to be that quick. Having your Death Knight stood by the eye almost the entirety of this phase helps this process out so much, because they can Death Grip low adds ready to blow up underneath the tree. After all the blobs are dead, the horror should be almost dead as well, and once he does finally die off, you want to get all of his blobs and just bring them under the eye one by one while you're soaking the next Death Blossom. You then have 1 Deathglare and 2 Corrupt Tentacles. You want to kill them and then soak the Death Blossoms that comes immediately afterwards. And you may notice at this point, if you have correctly dealt with all of the blobs up to this point and killed them off directly underneath the eye, you'll only ever need 2 more to actually get into the next phase. However, of course, you do not want to enter the tree with any adds still alive, and blowing them up at this point isn't necessarily that great. So instead we decide to kill off any extra blobs away from the eye, and then we use any remaining blobs at a later point to actually go inside. You do, however, not want to hang around forever, as you will at some point get a Corrupted Tentacle spawn, and you don't want this guy up on the transition. If you do get a tentacle spawn before you are going to transition, it's vital that you kill them before you do go inside, and that includes blobs as well. If you go inside the tree with any blobs or any adds up, you're definitely going to wipe. The blobs will go immune, they'll run into the middle of the tree and they'll just explode. That is always a wipe. And any tentacles that are alive outside just creates havoc inside, especially if it's a corrupted tentacle.
Now, the inside phase of Evil Tree has changed on Mythic. You'll notice that the boss starts with 66% HP and has a really large health pool. This is because each time the eye door dies, it will remove 33% of the boss's HP. So if you manage to do 33% of the boss's HP during this inside phase, which is very unlikely, but if you manage to do it, and then you did the whole outside phase again and then just blew up the eye in theory would just kill the tree by itself. So there's a little bit of trivia for you. Now, the main things that you'll be seeing different in this first inside phase is that large patches of corruption will grow out from the eye, covering the entire room apart from 2 narrow areas on opposite sides of the boss. You need to make sure that you enter those areas to avoid the silence and the ticking damage that you take. Now, you'll still get debuffs in this phase, however, as you are not pre-spread, it means that you'll need to move a lot quicker than you did on Heroic. You want to wait for the goo to disappear and then just run to an edge of the room and just try and make sure that you don't blow up on top of anyone else. After the first set of debuffs do explode, you'll then get a second round of goo. You want to try and get to the narrow area of clean ground that is closest to the door, as this will allow you to leave the room a hell of a lot easier. As soon as the debuffs have been applied, you want everyone to run outside and spread with them. You cannot spread inside, as by the time the debuffs have exploded, the door will close and instantly kill anyone inside. So as soon as you get those debuffs, you want someone to use an AoE movement speed increase just to get everyone outside and nicely spread out.
And it's at this point that phase 2 starts, and this is the most hectic phase, and it's probably the hardest part of your entire progression when it comes down to this fight, simply because of the amount of bloods that you need to be kiting. So from the outset, you'll have 2 Dominators. You want to nuke down one while you're multi-dotting and cleaving the other. As the first Dominator dies, 2 Deathglare Tentacles will spawn at the top of the eye. Make sure you have your DPS switch to them and kill them off. At the same time, all the 4 blobs that spawn from the Dominator, you want to kite towards the boss while lowering their HP, and then you want to blow them all off in one single go. And this is where you'll use your first set healing cooldowns again. Once you have your debuffs gone, you want your ranged DPS to move around the right hand side and kill off the new corrupted tentacles. You want your melee to stay behind and just finish off the death glares that are still alive, making sure that you keep them interrupted. You'll also want the last Dominator Tentacle to die around this point. Range will always want to prioritize the Corrupted Tentacles that spawn on the right side over this Dominator Tentacle. So melee, after you've dealt with the Death Glares, go straight back to the Dominator Tentacle. Or range, if it's on really low health, say like 5 or 10%, just swap to it very quickly just to kill it off. Otherwise your tank's gonna die. And while the ranged DPS are away killing off these Corrupted Tentacles, you want your melee to start killing off the blobs one by one. You should be able to kill around 3 before the next Death Blossom comes in. And it's at this point where you'll see your first Death Blossom, where you have blobs up at the exact same time, well, a significant amount of blobs. While soaking this Death Blossom, it's very likely that you're going to be taking stacks from adds, unless you CC them with stuns, with knockbacks, and everything, almost everything you have in your arsenal. If you're in a position where you have to choose between soaking one of the Death Blossom puddles and taking add stacks, or running away from the add and not soaking the Death Blossom at all, always pick soaking the Death Blossom. The healers can dispel your stacks, and if one of these things does explode because you decided to kite instead of soaking, it's a wipe. So always make sure you soak the Death Blossom. And it's vital from this point onwards, as you can see there is so many blobs up, that you do keep up with the killing them one by one, making sure that the debuff is up almost consistently on the raid without it overlapping. And it's after this Death Blossom that you'll get your first horror in this phase. You'll want to make sure that you damage him down as much as you possibly can. You'll then get 2 Death Glare Tentacles spawn around the eye. Everyone should swap onto them. Then range, you'll need to very quickly move over to the left hand side of the room because you'll need to kill off even more Corrupted Tentacles. This is perhaps one of the messiest moments of the entire encounter because you'll have a lot of people moving with the debuff from the Corrupted Tentacles. You'll have the Death Glare Tentacles that need to be interrupted if you haven't managed to kill them off by this point. The tank's going to be running around with a horror. There's going to be a fucking ridiculous amount of blobs up, especially if you've been slow at killing them. This is the messiest part of the entire encounter. It's at this point that you really want to be on top of ad control with stuns and CC and make sure those Corrupted Tentacles die as fast as you possibly can while still killing the blobs underneath the eye one by one. After the Death Glares and the Corrupted Tentacles have died, you then want to be damaging the horror as much as possible, while of course still keeping up with the pace of the blobs. You want all the remaining blobs in the room really to be dead as the horror dies, and ideally you want to tank this guy underneath the eye at this point, so all the blobs are there immediately ready to be exploded. If you kill all the 4 blobs that spawn out of him immediately, while using your second set healing cooldowns, this will then push you into the next phase with absolutely no adds up whatsoever. However, doing this is probably the tightest part of the entire encounter, and if you have fallen behind at any point during this phase, it's very unlikely that you are going to be able to push this, and instead you'll have to face the next set of adds instead, which consists of 3 Corrupted Tentacles and 1 Death Glare Tentacle. And the thing is, once you've killed those guys off, you then have a shit ton of blobs that you need to kill all around the room, and then more tentacles will spawn after that point. You slowly fall behind. So it's really important, and again we're emphasizing it again, that you keep on top of these blobs the entire phase. If they're not dying one by one over and over again, you do fall behind. And this is the point where you'll see it. If you do happen to have a stray blob or 2, you can simply just root them or have players stay outside and kite them around. If you're keeping up with everything that's going on, these blobs simply shouldn't even exist and you won't get the wave of the 3 Corrupted Tentacles and the 1 Death Glare. You can just go straight inside and finish off the boss.
However, you don't want to celebrate too early when you're going inside for the second time, because although the boss will lose another 33% health as the eye does die, there are more things that you need to deal with. On top of the goo spawning on the ground, leaving the 2 narrow corridors where you can stand, you'll also have 6 shriveled eye stalks spawn around the room. Now these guys cast a Mind Flare on a random target just like the Death Glare Tentacles, but it does the exact same amount of damage as the Death Glare Tentacles, which is about 1.1 million or something like that on the first tick of the application. It really hurts, so at this point you do have a choice. Either you can nuke the boss down whilst just interrupting the adds as much as you can, or kill off the first wave of these guys and then nuke the boss. Each of these adds have around 5 million HP, and the boss should be pretty low at this point. We always just nuke the boss while interrupting the adds around the side, because it works for us because of where we use Bloodlust in the encounter. However, the choice is up to you. If you feel that you're going to be in this phase for a fairly long period of time, you still have like roughly the 80-second timer before the boss will one-shot you. If you feel you're going to be using quite a lot of that time, then you definitely are going to need to be killing these adds. However, if the boss is like on 8% health or something, generally speaking, you can just interrupt, ignore them, and nuke the boss down. But once again, it does depend on your composition and the situation you're in. Just note that new waves of these ice stalks will continue to spawn throughout the phase, so if you kill off one wave, another wave will shortly replace it, or if you just keep interrupting them, more and more of them are going to spawn. So either way, you are fighting against the clock. And that's it. After you get in there, at least with our strategy, you go in there, interrupt the ads, and just blow up the boss, and then he dies. So that's how the fight plays out for us, week on week. However, there are some extra things that we do need to go over. One of them is Bloodlust Timing. Now, we always use Bloodlust on the first inside tree phase. This allows us to have a far shorter second inside tree phase, which is probably one of the more irritating points of the encounter, especially if you get there nice and cleanly and then you wipe. It's very, very irritating, so getting that second phase shorter by bloodlusting earlier does help us out a lot. Another strategy you could use is using Bloodlust on the second outside phase on the double Dominator. This allows both of the Dominators to die at roughly the same time, meaning that you can actually group up all 8 blobs and blow them up for one big explosion, making the second outside phase a lot cleaner because you just reduce the amount of ads that you need to kite and therefore control by 4, which is really nice. It's like a nice free set of ads that you can kill. When blowing up all 8 at once, you want to use both sets of cooldowns while having people using personal cooldowns. It hurts a hell of a lot and you can't be out of the spirit link or anything because you're probably going to die. Make sure you group up when you blow them up so you're just safe. Now, either of these Bloodlust times are viable and you'll just want to experiment to see which one works for you the best depending on your composition or just generally your playstyle. This boss is very delicate, but there are a hell of a lot of choices that you can make that aren't necessarily wrong. You'll just get to make them and see what works for your group the best. Another one of these choices is who kills the ads. Now, throughout phase 1 and 2, mainly in phase 2, the ads need to be constantly damaged. It isn't particularly viable to kill each individual ad from 100% to 0 each time you want an explosion. You won't be able to do them back to back that frequently because unless you have a lot of people working on them, they're not going to go from 100% to 0% in that time scale. Instead, it is important that the ads are at a low HP, allowing you just to kill them quickly when you want to. However, if they are too low, it is very likely that you'll have an ad die when you don't want it to die, which could cause you to have a double explosion or have an ad die in the incorrect place. So you want to assign certain players to keep the ad health to around 25 to 50%. Shadow Priest dots with a barrage or 2 from our hunters occasionally will generally do the trick. However, this is so very dependent on your composition and you will need to make the decision for yourself, and the first couple of pulls that you do, ads are probably going to die all over the place as you just try and figure out how much damage you need to put on them and trying to get the balance right. It's also very important that you have a player in your group who is marking targets, calling out which one is going to die. It is so important that they are vocal and that they have the ability to mark targets because that can carry an entire encounter. If they just call out this needs to die and then this ad is dying and then this ad is dying, people can work their damage around it, people can work their kiting around it, and it can just make it so much cleaner. You need to have that player calling something out. If everyone is quiet or everyone's just shouting about random shit, this fight is going to be so much more difficult for you. And the last thing that we can really think that you might need to have a choice about is when you want to blow up 4 or maybe when you want to blow up 8 ads at once. There are multiple points in the fight where you could squeeze in another stacked explosion of ads. This is something that once again you'll need to decide for yourself as it does depend on multiple factors. One of them could be your healing comp. Certain healing comps have way better cooldowns than others, and if you don't have those cooldowns available, then you won't be able to blow up an extra set of 4 randomly in the middle of phase 2. As you've seen, probably just by watching the video, there is a ton of shit going on, and the shit is never the same from pull to pull. Something else normally crops up and there's a lot going on. So finding a place where you can reliably kill a set of 4 ads every single time you're at that point is pretty difficult to do. It isn't impossible by any means, especially if you have good damage and you have a good healing composition. But once again, you don't want to say we're always going to kill 4 ads here when you can't do it every single time because you're going to lead to mindless wipes. Overall, this decision really does fall to your raid leader, and if you feel that you can get extra explosions early and you can do it safely, then you should always try and do it because it just makes the fight that much cleaner.
And that's all the extra tips we really have for this encounter. Again, I know we've already said it a load of times in this video. The way to make this fight the easiest is by killing blobs one by one, super fast, and blowing up 4 at a time at set locations, or maybe even the 8. But that's something that, again, you need to play around with. But thank you very much for watching, guys. If this video helped you out at all, then please do smash a like on it. It helps us out as well. And before you go, do check out our sponsor, Discord. Discord allows you to have your very own server for your friends or your guild, where you can make voice communication servers, text channels, you can set up all various tags, mods, all that sort of shit. And the best thing about it is that it's entirely free. We have our very own community Discord server where you can come ask questions about this particular boss in this video, or if you wanted to talk about your legendary that you just got that I still need in my paladin because the game just doesn't fucking give it to me, then go for it. And a huge shout out to all the peeps that are supporting us over on Patreon. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much, and we shall see you all in the next guide.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.